A bear reunites with its father after 39 years. His reaction will melt your heart. The morning sun cast long shadows across Thomas Bell's study, where decades of research papers and wildlife photographs yellowed at their edges. His weathered hands traced the outline of an old photograph, a younger version of himself, kneeling beside a bear cub with a distinctive scar on its snout. The image triggered a flood of memories that he'd kept locked away for 40 years. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Let us know which city you're watching us from. Stay tuned. The stillness of his retirement was shattered by the sharp ring of his phone. Sarah Matthews, the head ranger at Yellowstone National Park, spoke with an urgency that made his heart race. "Dr. Bell, I apologize for disturbing your retirement, but there's something you need to know. We've been tracking an unusual grizzly bear in the park. The rangers describe it as having a peculiar scar across its snout and its behavior. Well, it's unlike anything we've seen before." Thomas's hand trembled as he set down his coffee cup. The description matched perfectly. Could it really be Boomer? The bear cub he had rescued, raised, and released back into the wild 4 decades ago. The same bear that had changed the course of his career in wildlife conservation. "There's more," Sarah continued. "The bear has been exhibiting strange patterns. It approaches certain areas where researchers work, but never aggressively. It's almost as if it's watching us." Several rangers have reported hearing a faint jingling sound before spotting it, almost like a bell. The mention of a bell sent Thomas's mind spinning back to that last day with Boomer, when he had fastened a small brass bell around the young bear's neck, a final gift before releasing him into the wild. The bell was supposed to help track the cub during those first crucial weeks of freedom, but surely, after all these years... "Dr. Bell," Sarah's voice pulled him back to the present. "We could use your expertise. Your experience with bear behavior, especially with this particular situation, could be invaluable." Thomas glanced around his study at the life he had built after leaving field research behind. The walls were lined with awards and certificates, testament to a distinguished career in wildlife conservation. But none of them held the weight of that single photograph of him and Boomer. "I'll need to make some arrangements," he heard himself say, surprising even himself with the steadiness in his voice. "But I can be there within the week." After ending the call, Thomas walked to his bedroom closet and pulled out an old field pack. Buried at the bottom, wrapped in a faded bandana, was a small brass bell identical to the one he had given Boomer. He had kept it all these years, a reminder of the extraordinary bond he had shared with the bear cub. As he packed his equipment, his phone buzzed with an email from Emma Hawthorne, a young biologist at the park and the daughter of his former research partner. "I heard they contacted you," she wrote. "I'll be your liaison during your stay, but Thomas, I need you to understand something. Even if this is the same bear, and that's a big if, 40 years is an incredibly long time. Whatever you're hoping to find here might not exist anymore." Thomas appreciated Emma's concern, but she didn't understand. The connection he had shared with Boomer wasn't something that could be measured by scientific instruments or explained in research papers. It had been something deeper, something that defied conventional wisdom about human-animal relationships. That evening, as Thomas prepared for his journey, he found himself drawn back to his old research journals. The pages contained detailed observations of Boomer's development, his first steps, his playful attempts to catch fish, the way he would respond to the sound of the bell. But more than that, they contained the story of a connection that had shaped both their lives. The decision to release Boomer back into the wild had been the hardest choice of Thomas's life. The young bear had been ready, but Thomas wasn't sure he had been. In the weeks that followed, he had thrown himself into his research, eventually becoming one of the leading authorities on bear behavior and conservation. But he had never again allowed himself to form such a close bond with any of his study subjects. As the sun set, Thomas stood at his window, watching the colors fade from the sky. Tomorrow, he would begin his journey back to Yellowstone, back to the wilderness that had once been his home, back to the possibility of reuniting with Boomer. The logical part of his mind told him that Emma was right. The chances of this being the same bear were astronomical. But there was another part of him, the part that still remembered the trust in Boomer's eyes, that dared to hope. He carefully packed the brass bell in his bag. Whether this bear turned out to be Boomer or not, Thomas knew his life was about to change again. The wilderness was calling him back, and this time he was ready to answer. The vast expanse of Yellowstone National Park stretched before Thomas as he drove through the entrance gate, the morning mist still clinging to the ancient pines. Every mile deeper into the park stirred memories of his younger days, when these trails and clearings had been his second home. The rental car's GPS directed him toward the research station, where Emma Hawthorne would be waiting. But Thomas barely needed the guidance. His body remembered every turn of these roads. As he pulled into the gravel parking lot of the research station, a young woman in a ranger's uniform stepped out onto the wooden porch. Emma Hawthorne had her father's determined stance and sharp, observant eyes. She approached his car with a measured stride that reminded Thomas so much of James, her father, during their research days together. "Dr. Bell," she greeted him with a professional nod, though her eyes betrayed a hint of concern. "Welcome back to Yellowstone. I hope your journey wasn't too tiring." Thomas grabbed his old field pack from the passenger seat, the brass bell safely tucked inside. "The mountains haven't changed much," he replied, taking in the familiar scent of pine and wild sage. "Though I suppose I have." Emma led him into the research station, where maps and tracking data covered the walls. She pointed to recent sightings of the bear in question, marked with red pins across a topographical map. "We've been monitoring its movements for the past 3 months. The pattern is unusual. It stays within this general area, even though there are better feeding grounds to the north." Thomas studied the map intently, his finger tracing the familiar territory. "This was where we used to—" He paused, collecting himself. "This was Boomer's favorite area for foraging when he was young." Emma's expression softened slightly, but her scientific skepticism remained evident. "Dr. Bell, Thomas, I need you to understand something. Even if this bear has similar markings to Boomer, the chances of it being the same animal after 40 years are extremely low. Grizzlies in the wild rarely live past 25 years. "I understand probability, Emma," Thomas replied, his voice gentle but firm. "I've spent my career studying these animals, but there are things about Boomer that made him unique. The scar on his snout, yes, but also his behaviors, his patterns." He pulled out the old photograph from his wallet, showing it to Emma. "Look at the marking. It's not just any scar. It's distinctive, like a crescent moon." Emma examined the photograph carefully. "The ranger's descriptions do match this pattern," she admitted. But still, their discussion was interrupted by a rapid knock on the door. A young ranger burst in, slightly out of breath. "Ms. Hawthorne, we've got fresh tracks, large ones, heading toward Thunder Basin. And there's something else. We found these." The ranger held out a plastic evidence bag containing what appeared to be berry seeds, arranged in an almost deliberate pattern on a flat rock. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. "Where exactly did you find these?" "Just off the main trail near the old observation post," the ranger replied. "It's the 3rd time we've found something similar this week." Thomas turned to Emma, his eyes alight with recognition. "Boomer used to do this, arrange his leftover berries in patterns. I thought it was just a quirk he developed while I was caring for him, but he continued doing it even after his release. It became one of our markers for tracking him during those first few months." Emma studied the evidence bag with renewed interest. "That's remarkable, but it could still be coincidental. Bears are intelligent animals, and they can develop various habits." "Then let me see for myself," Thomas insisted. "Take me to where these tracks are. If this is Boomer, I'll know. There are things about him that only I would recognize." Emma hesitated, then nodded slowly. "We can head out there today, but we need to follow proper protocols. This is still a wild animal we're dealing with, regardless of any past connection you might have had." As they prepared their gear for the field expedition, Thomas carefully attached the old brass bell to his belt. The soft jingling brought back a flood of memories, of early morning tracking sessions, of Boomer learning to fish in the shallow streams, of trust built over countless shared moments. "That bell," Emma noted, watching him. "Is it the same as—" "It's twin," Thomas confirmed. "I kept it all these years. Maybe it was sentiment, or maybe some part of me always knew I'd need it again." As they loaded their equipment into Emma's research vehicle, the morning sun finally broke through the cloud cover, illuminating the vast wilderness before them. Somewhere out there, Thomas knew, was an answer to a question he'd carried for 40 years. Whether it would be the answer he hoped for remained to be seen, but for the first time in decades, he felt truly alive with possibility. The morning fog hung thick in the valley as Thomas and Emma made their way along the worn trail. Their boots crunched softly against the frost-covered ground, creating a rhythm that matched Thomas's quickening heartbeat. Every few yards, they stopped to examine signs: a scratched tree trunk, disturbed earth, or the occasional tuft of fur caught on low-hanging branches. "These marks," Thomas whispered, running his fingers along deep claw marks in a pine's bark. "They're deliberate. See how they're grouped in threes. Boomer developed this pattern when he was young." It was like his signature. Emma crouched beside him, her skepticism wrestling with professional curiosity. "Many bears mark trees in similar ways, Thomas. It's territorial behavior." She paused, studying the marks more closely. "Though I have to admit, there's something unusually systematic about these." They continued their trek, climbing higher into the misty terrain. The old brass bell at Thomas's belt created a soft, intermittent melody that seemed to merge with the natural sounds of the forest. Each step brought back memories, teaching Boomer to find honey, watching him learn to fish in the shallow streams, those final days before release when Thomas knew their time together was coming to an end. "Wait!" Emma suddenly whispered, her hand shooting out to stop Thomas. "Look there, through the trees." Through the morning haze, about 50 yards ahead, a massive shape moved with surprising grace between the pines. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. Even at this distance, there was something familiar about the way the bear moved, a slight favor to its right side that he remembered from when Boomer had hurt his paw as a cub. "Don't move," Emma cautioned, but Thomas was already reaching for his binoculars with trembling hands. Through the lenses, the bear's features became clearer. It was an enormous male grizzly, its fur silvered with age, but still thick and healthy. As it turned its head to investigate a fallen log, Thomas saw it, the distinctive crescent-shaped scar across its snout, exactly as he remembered. "It's him," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Emma, it's really him. The scar, the way he moves, even the way he's investigating that log. Boomer always had this particular way of—" The bear suddenly lifted its head, nostrils flaring as it caught their scent on the morning breeze. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, its eyes met Thomas's through the mist. In that instant, 40 years seemed to dissolve. Thomas saw recognition flicker in those ancient eyes, a spark of awareness that transcended time and nature itself. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the bear melted back into the forest, leaving only disturbed underbrush and a profound silence in its wake. "Did you see it?" Thomas asked Emma, his voice barely above a whisper. "The scar. It's identical to the one in the photograph. And the way he looked at us, at me." Emma was already making notes in her field journal, her scientific training taking over. "The physical characteristics match your descriptions, yes. But Thomas, we need to be objective here. Even if this is the same bear, and I admit the evidence is compelling, He's wild now. He's been wild for 40 years. You don't understand, Thomas replied, still staring at the spot where the bear had stood. That look in his eyes. Boomer always had this way of making eye contact. It was different from other bears, more direct, more aware. He turned to Emma, his expression both excited and pleading. Your father would have understood. James always said there were things about animal behavior that couldn't be fully explained by science. Emma's expression softened at the mention of her father. Dad did talk about your work with Boomer. He said it challenged everything he thought he knew about Ursine cognition and memory. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. But he also warned me about the dangers of anthropomorphizing wild animals. Thomas nodded, acknowledging her concern. I'm not romanticizing this, Emma. I spent my career studying bear behavior. I know the risks, the realities. But what Boomer and I shared, it was something unique. Something that deserved to be studied and understood, not dismissed. As they began making their way back to the research station, Thomas noticed something that made him stop in his tracks. There, in a patch of soft earth, was a perfect print of the bear's right front paw. And just like he remembered, there was a slight irregularity in the pad pattern, a small scar from that long-ago injury. Look at this, he called to Emma. See that mark in the pad? That's from when he cut his paw on a sharp rock while learning to fish. It never fully healed, always left this distinctive mark in his prints. Emma photographed the print and took measurements, her scientific skepticism gradually giving way to intrigue. The evidence is starting to stack up, she admitted, but that only makes our situation more complex. If this really is Boomer, his unusual behavior and apparent recognition of human presence could make him a concern for park management. Thomas knew she was right. A bear that showed too much comfort around humans could be deemed a risk, regardless of its history. But he also knew that he couldn't walk away. Not now, not when he was so close to reconnecting with the creature that had shaped his entire career and life's understanding of the relationship between humans and wild animals. The decision to camp overnight in Boomer's territory wasn't an easy one to make. Emma had initially protested, citing safety protocols and park regulations, but Thomas's argument about the importance of observing nocturnal behavior eventually won her over. As the sun began to set, they established their camp in a small clearing, close enough to the research station for safety, but deep enough in the wilderness to maintain their connection with their subject. You know, Emma said, as she helped Thomas set up the specialized research equipment around their campsite, my father used to tell me stories about your camping expeditions. He said you could sleep through anything except the sound of an animal in distress. Thomas smiled, adjusting the motion-sensitive cameras. James was a remarkable observer. He understood that sometimes the most important scientific discoveries happen when you're not actively looking for them. He paused, his hands working automatically as his mind drifted back. That's how it was with Boomer. Every day, he showed us something new, something unexpected about bear behavior. As darkness settled over the forest, the wilderness transformed. New sounds emerged, the soft hooting of owls, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, the whisper of wind through the ancient pines. Thomas and Emma sat by their small campfire, its flames carefully contained within a park-approved fire pit. Tell me about the day you had to release him, Emma said softly, her scientific detachment momentarily giving way to genuine curiosity. Dad never talked much about it. Thomas stared into the flames, the old brass bell resting in his lap. It was the hardest day of my career. Boomer was ready. Physically, he was strong, healthy, fully capable of surviving in the wild. But there was this understanding between us. When I led him to the release site, he kept looking back at me, not with fear or uncertainty, but almost like he was memorizing my face. A branch snapped in the darkness beyond their fire's light, causing both of them to fall silent. Emma reached for her flashlight, but Thomas gently put his hand on her arm, stopping her. "Wait," he whispered. "Listen." The sounds of movement grew closer, the deliberate crushing of fallen leaves, the soft scraping of claws against bark. Whatever was out there wasn't trying to hide its presence. Thomas's heart began to race as he recognized the pattern of movement, so similar to how Boomer used to circle their research camp decades ago. Through the darkness, they could make out a massive silhouette moving between the trees. The fire's light caught glimpses of fur, flashes of movement that seemed both familiar and otherworldly. Emma tensely gripped her tranquilizer gun, but Thomas remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond their camp. The visitor circled their camp twice, each circuit bringing it slightly closer. Thomas could hear its breathing now, deep and rhythmic, and underneath it all he detected a familiar sound, a soft, huffing noise that Boomer used to make when he was curious about something. "Thomas," Emma whispered urgently, "we should retreat to the vehicle." But Thomas couldn't move. He was transported back to countless nights like this one, when a young Boomer would investigate their camp, learning the boundaries between his world and theirs. The bear in the darkness moved with the same careful curiosity, the same deliberate grace. Suddenly the movement stopped. For several long moments the forest held its breath. Then, as quietly as it had appeared, the presence withdrew, leaving behind only the sound of retreating footsteps in the underbrush. Thomas released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That was him, Emma. The way he moved, the sounds he made. It was exactly how he used to investigate our camp. Emma was already making notes in her journal, her hands slightly shaky, but her scientific training holding firm. "The behavior is remarkably consistent with your historical observations," she admitted. "But it's also incredibly unusual for a wild bear to show this level of comfort around a human camp without any sign of aggression or food-seeking behavior." As the night grew deeper, Thomas found himself unable to sleep. He sat by the dying embers of their fire, lost in memories and possibilities. The old brass bell lay heavy in his hands, its surface reflecting the last glimmers of firelight. Just before dawn, as the first hints of grey touched the eastern sky, Thomas heard movement again. This time it was closer, much closer. He remained absolutely still as heavy footsteps approached the edge of their camp. There was a soft clink of metal on wood, and then the footsteps retreated. When the sun finally rose, Thomas discovered his brass bell was missing from where he'd left it by the fire. In its place, hanging from a nearby branch at exactly his eye level, was another bell, old, rusted, but unmistakably the twin of the one he'd given Boomer 40 years ago. The discovery of the old bell sent ripples through the research team. Emma spent the morning photographing it, measuring it, and comparing its wear patterns to historical records. Thomas, however, couldn't take his eyes off it. Every dent, every scratch told the story of 40 years in the wilderness. "The odds of this being coincidence are astronomical," Emma admitted, carefully placing the bell in a protective case. "The placement, the timing, it suggests not just recognition, but complex memory and deliberate communication." Dark clouds began gathering over the mountains as they planned their next move. The weather station had warned of an approaching storm system, but Thomas insisted on exploring deeper into the territory where the bear had been most frequently sighted. "There's an old ranger station about 2 miles north," Emma said, studying her topographical map. "If the weather turns, we can use it for shelter." She glanced at Thomas. "It hasn't been maintained in years, but it's still structurally sound." They set out under increasingly threatening skies, following a trail that had nearly disappeared under decades of natural growth. Thomas noticed signs of recent bear activity everywhere: freshly broken branches, disturbed earth, and what appeared to be deliberately arranged stones near certain trees. "These markers," Thomas explained, pointing to a particular arrangement. "Boomer used to do this when we were tracking together. He would move stones into patterns, creating reference points for our research routes. Emma photographed the stones, her skepticism increasingly challenged by the mounting evidence. The level of cognitive function required for this kind of behavior, it goes beyond anything documented in wild bears. The first drops of rain began to fall as they reached a clearing. Thunder rolled across the valley, and the wind picked up dramatically, whipping through the trees with increasing force. Emma pointed to a structure barely visible through the gathering gloom, the abandoned ranger station. They reached the station just as the storm broke in earnest. The old wooden building creaked under the assault of the wind, but its walls held firm. Emma found some emergency supplies in a dusty cabinet while Thomas moved to the window, drawn by some instinct he couldn't explain. Lightning illuminated the clearing in stark flashes, transforming the landscape into a series of frozen moments. In one of these flashes, Thomas saw him, Boomer, standing motionless in the rain, his massive form silhouetted against the dark forest. The bear was looking directly at the station, directly at Thomas. "Emma," Thomas whispered, not daring to move. "The northeast window." Emma approached carefully, her breath catching as another flash revealed the bear still standing there, unmoved by the raging storm. The rain matted his fur, highlighting the silver that age had brought to his coat. The distinctive scar on his snout was clearly visible now, exactly as Thomas remembered it. "He's positioning himself deliberately," Emma observed, her voice barely audible over the storm. "He's maintaining eye contact while keeping a safe distance. This is unprecedented behavior." Thomas felt an overwhelming urge to go outside, to cross the distance between them, but something in Boomer's stance told him to wait. The bear's posture conveyed a complex message, recognition mixed with caution, connection tempered by the wisdom of years spent in the wild. For what seemed like hours, they maintained this silent vigil. Boomer remained in his position, occasionally shifting his weight, but never breaking his gaze from the station's window. Thomas stood equally still, decades of unspoken communication passing between them in the storm's elemental drama. "He's not just watching us," Thomas said softly. "He's guarding us." This is how he used to position himself when we camped in unfamiliar territory, always at the edge of our perimeter, always facing potential threats. Emma had been taking continuous notes, her scientific training wrestling with the extraordinary scene before her. The behavioral implications are staggering. This suggests not just memory retention, but the persistence of learned protective behaviors over decades. As the storm began to ease, Boomer finally moved. With deliberate slowness, he raised his head, revealing his full size. In the dim light, Thomas could see that despite his age, the bear was in magnificent condition, powerful, healthy, and fully adapted to his wild existence. Then, in a gesture that brought tears to Thomas's eyes, Boomer lifted his right paw slightly off the ground. The same paw he had injured as a cub, the same characteristic movement he had used whenever he was asking permission to approach camp. "Oh my God," Emma breathed, recognizing the behavior from her father's old research notes. "He's using the same signaling system you developed during his rehabilitation." Before Thomas could respond, a distant sound caught Boomer's attention. The bear's head turned sharply toward the forest, his entire posture changing from gentle recognition to alert vigilance. With one final look at the station, he disappeared into the underbrush, moving with surprising speed for his size. The storm continued to recede, but Thomas remained at the window, processing what he had just witnessed. The encounter had confirmed what his heart had known from the beginning. This was indeed Boomer, and their connection had somehow endured 4 decades of separation. The morning after the storm brought a crystalline clarity to the air that made every detail of the landscape stand out in sharp relief. Thomas stood at the ranger station's porch, both bells now hanging from his belt, their gentle chiming mixing with the sound of water dripping from the trees. He had made his decision during the long night. It was time to visit the clearing, where he and Boomer had spent countless hours during those formative months 4 decades ago. "I'm not sure this is wise," Emma said, checking her tranquilizer gun and radio equipment. "After last night's encounter, we should be focusing on documenting the behavioral patterns we've observed, not pushing for more direct contact." Thomas understood her concern, but he also knew that this moment required something beyond standard scientific protocol. "That clearing was special," he explained, as they prepared for the trek. "It's where Boomer learned to trust humans, where he developed the behaviors that made him unique. If there's any place where we can fully understand what's happening here, it's there." The hike to the clearing took them through some of the park's oldest growth forest. Thomas was surprised by how easily the path came back to him. Every landmark, every distinctive tree seemed to have been waiting patiently in his memory for this moment of return. "Here," he said, stopping at the edge of a natural break in the forest. "This is where we used to work together." The clearing had changed over the decades. What had once been an open space was now partially filled with young trees and dense undergrowth. But the essential character of the place remained. The way the morning light filtered through the canopy, the natural amphitheater created by the surrounding slopes, the small stream that cut through one corner. "Dad's old journals mentioned this place," Emma said softly, taking in the scene. "He called it the classroom because of how much you both learned about bear behavior here." Thomas moved to the center of the clearing, memories washing over him with each step. This is where Boomer first learned to respond to the bell. We'd play a game. I'd hide, and he'd have to find me using the sound as a guide. It helped develop his trust in human signals without making him dependent on human presence. Drawing both bells from his belt, Thomas held them up, letting them catch the morning light. The contrast between them was striking, one polished and maintained, the other weathered by 40 years in the wilderness. Yet when they rang together, their voices harmonized perfectly. "What exactly are you planning?" Emma asked, though she already knew the answer. "Something that goes against every protocol in your manual," Thomas admitted. He took a deep breath, then began to ring the bells together, letting their combined sound echo through the valley. The familiar melody, a simple pattern of 3 rings followed by a pause, filled the clearing just as it had so many years ago. The forest fell silent, as if every creature was holding its breath. Thomas continued the pattern, each set of rings carrying decades of memory and hope. Emma stood at the edge of the clearing, her scientific detachment warring with the undeniable power of the moment. Minutes passed. Then, from the dense forest on the northern edge of the clearing, a shadow emerged. Boomer moved with deliberate grace, each step measured and careful. In the clear morning light, every detail was visible. The silver-streaked fur, the battle scars of a life lived wild, and most distinctively, the crescent-shaped mark on his snout that had first brought Thomas back to Yellowstone. The bear paused at the edge of the clearing, his posture alert but not aggressive. His eyes fixed on Thomas, showing that same deep intelligence that had marked him as special all those years ago. Thomas continued ringing the bells softly, their sound now barely more than a whisper. Boomer took another step forward, then another. His movements showed no fear, no aggression, only a careful, measured approach that spoke of memory and recognition. He was close enough now that Thomas could see his breath in the cool morning air. The moment was shattered by a sudden crashing sound from the undergrowth. A younger male grizzly, probably about 5 years old, burst into the clearing. His posture was aggressive, hackles raised, clearly seeing Thomas and Emma as intruders in his territory. What happened next defied everything Emma thought she knew about bear behavior. Boomer, moving with surprising speed for his age, positioned himself between the younger bear and the humans. His stance was unmistakable, protective, authoritative, brooking no challenge. The younger bear reared up, possibly confused by the older bear's behavior. Boomer responded with a roar that seemed to shake the very ground, a sound that carried not just volume, but decades of earned authority. The younger bear held his ground for a moment, then slowly backed away, disappearing into the forest as quickly as he had appeared. When Boomer turned back to Thomas, there was something new in his gaze, a complexity of emotion that transcended simple recognition. It was a look that seemed to encompass their shared past, the long years of separation, and this unexpected present where their paths had crossed again. The incident in the clearing spread through the park administration like wildfire. By afternoon, Thomas and Emma found themselves in an emergency meeting with Sarah Matthews, the head ranger, and a panel of park officials. The conference room at park headquarters was tense with competing concerns and perspectives. "Let me be clear about what we're dealing with here," Sarah began, spreading photographs across the table. "We have a grizzly bear showing unprecedented levels of interaction with humans, actively approaching research stations, and now apparently intervening in potential wildlife conflicts. While the scientific implications are fascinating, our primary concern must be visitor safety." Thomas leaned forward, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. "What you're calling unprecedented interaction, I'm calling evidence of something remarkable. Boomer isn't just approaching randomly. He's displaying complex social behaviors that challenge everything we think we know about long-term ursine cognitive function." "Dr. Bell," interrupted Richard Morrison, the park's safety coordinator, "with all due respect to your history with this animal, we're talking about a wild grizzly bear in a national park that receives millions of visitors annually. The fact that it's showing unusual comfort around humans makes it potentially more dangerous, not less." Emma spoke up, her scientific training giving weight to her words. "Our observations suggest something more nuanced. The bear's behavior shows sophisticated decision-making and risk assessment. The incident this morning, where he intervened with the younger bear, demonstrates not aggression, but a protective instinct that actually reduces risk to humans." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Be that as it may, we're considering transferring the bear to the Cedar Grove Conservation Center. It's a controlled environment where these behaviors can be studied without risking public safety." The suggestion hit Thomas like a physical blow. Cedar Grove was a respected facility, but it was still a captive environment, a cage, no matter how large or well-designed. "You can't do that to him," he protested, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. "Boomer has lived free for 40 years. He's not just surviving, he's thriving. He's become an integral part of this ecosystem." "An ecosystem that includes human visitors," Morrison countered. "What happens when tourist season peaks? When families with children encounter a bear that doesn't show normal avoidance behaviors?" "Then we adapt our protocols," Thomas argued. "We establish new guidelines based on what we're learning. This is an opportunity to understand something extraordinary about the relationship between humans and wildlife. Forcing him into captivity would not only be cruel, it would be a massive loss to science." Emma pulled out her research notes. "Our documentation shows that the bear maintains a consistent territory away from main tourist areas. His interactions have been limited to research personnel who are trained to handle wildlife encounters. There's no evidence of food-seeking behavior or aggression toward humans." The debate continued for hours, with proposals and counter-proposals flying across the table. Thomas felt the weight of 40 years pressing down on him, all the research, all the discoveries, all leading to this moment where he had to fight for Boomer's freedom. "What about a compromise?" Sarah finally suggested, rubbing her temples. "We increase monitoring, establish a larger restricted zone around his known territory, and develop new protocols specifically for this situation." "But," she held up a hand to forestall Thomas's immediate agreement, "at the first sign of any behavior that could endanger visitors, we revisit the relocation option. We could also use this as an educational opportunity, Emma added quickly. Develop a research program around studying these unique behaviors, something that could advance our understanding of wildlife cognition while maintaining safe distances for observation. Thomas felt a glimmer of hope. I could help design the protocols, he offered. No one understands Boomer's behaviors better than I do. We could create guidelines that protect both the public and his freedom. Morrison still looked skeptical. And what happens when word gets out? When people start deliberately trying to find this friendly bear? We could have a circus on our hands. Then we control the narrative, Emma suggested. Present it as a serious scientific study, not a curiosity. Emphasize the importance of maintaining distance and respecting wildlife. Use it to teach people about responsible wildlife interaction. As the meeting continued into the evening, Thomas found his thoughts drifting to that morning's encounter in the clearing. The way Boomer had positioned himself between them and danger, the intelligence in his eyes, the clear evidence that 4 decades of wild living hadn't erased their connection, it all pointed to something that transcended typical wildlife management concerns. Finally, Sarah called for a decision. We'll implement enhanced monitoring and restricted zones immediately. Dr. Bell will need your input on the protocols. Ms. Hawthorne, please prepare a detailed research proposal focusing on safe observation methods. But understand this. If there's any indication that public safety is at risk, we'll have to take more decisive action. As they left the meeting, Emma noticed Thomas's preoccupied expression. You're thinking about Cedar Grove, aren't you? Thomas nodded slowly. Boomer spent the first months of his life in captivity. Everything special about him, his intelligence, his ability to bridge the gap between wild and human worlds, came from finding the right balance between human connection and natural freedom. Putting him in a facility now would be like erasing everything he's become. The early morning mist still clung to the valley as Thomas prepared for what he knew would be a crucial day. After the tense meeting with park officials, he understood that he needed to demonstrate something beyond mere recognition between himself and Boomer. He needed to show that their connection could actually enhance safety and understanding in the park. You're planning to recreate the old training exercises, aren't you? Emma asked as she helped him set up the observation equipment. Her tone carried equal measures of professional curiosity and concern. Not training exercises, Thomas corrected gently, checking the bells at his belt. Games. They were always games to Boomer. That was what made them special. He participated because he wanted to, not because he had to. They had chosen a series of locations throughout Boomer's territory, each one selected for its similarity to the places where Thomas and Boomer had worked together 4 decades ago. Emma had insisted on setting up remote cameras and monitoring equipment at each site, ensuring that everything would be documented for both scientific and safety purposes. The park authorities are watching this very closely, Emma reminded him. If anything goes wrong, Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of what they were attempting. This isn't just about proving our connection. It's about showing that understanding between humans and wildlife can lead to safer interactions for everyone. The first location was a small grove where fallen logs created natural hiding places. This had been one of Boomer's favorite spots for what Thomas had called their seeking game, a sophisticated version of hide and seek that had helped develop the bear's problem-solving skills. The game taught him to use multiple senses, Thomas explained as he positioned himself. Sound from the bell, scent tracking, visual cues. But most importantly, it taught him patience and control in approaching humans. Emma took her position at the observation point, equipment ready. And you really think he'll remember the rules after all this time? Thomas smiled softly. Watch. He began the sequence they had used so many years ago, 3 rings of the bell, followed by a specific pattern of movement through the grove. Then, finding a suitable hiding spot behind a large fallen pine, he waited, holding the bell completely still. The forest fell into an expectant silence. Minutes passed, marked only by the soft sounds of wilderness, bird calls, rustling leaves, the distant murmur of running water. Emma kept her eyes fixed on her monitoring equipment, tracking any movement in the surrounding area. Then, almost imperceptibly, the pattern of forest sounds began to change. Something large was moving through the undergrowth, its progress deliberate but incredibly quiet for its size. Thomas remained perfectly still, remembering how this part of the game had always tested Boomer's patience as much as his tracking skills. The movement stopped. Through a gap in the logs, Thomas could see Boomer standing at the edge of the grove, his head lifted, testing the air. The bear's posture was relaxed but attentive, exactly as it had been during their training sessions so long ago. Slowly, methodically, Boomer began to work the area. He moved in an expanding spiral pattern, the exact search technique Thomas had taught him. When he reached areas where Thomas's scent was stronger, he would pause, considering before moving on. It wasn't the behavior of a bear following pure instinct. It was the calculated search pattern of an intelligent creature employing learned strategies. Emma watched in amazement as Boomer systematically eliminated hiding spots, working his way closer to Thomas's position. "This is incredible," she whispered into her recorder. "The bear is demonstrating not just remembered behaviors, but complex problem-solving skills and structured search patterns." Finally, Boomer stopped directly in front of Thomas's hiding place. Instead of immediately approaching, he sat back on his haunches and made a soft, huffing sound, the exact signal he used to give when he had successfully completed a search. Thomas emerged slowly from his hiding spot, speaking softly in the same tone he had used 40 years ago. "Well done, old friend." Old. Well done. Boomer remained seated, watching Thomas with that same intense intelligence they had witnessed in the clearing. Then, in a gesture that brought tears to Emma's eyes, the bear gently laid down, placing his massive head on his paws, a position of trust that spoke volumes about their enduring connection. "Notice his body language," Thomas called softly to Emma. "Complete relaxation, but still maintaining appropriate distance. He remembers not just the game, but all the safety protocols we established." They spent the next hour documenting Boomer's behavior as Thomas led him through other remembered games. Exercises in distance maintenance, responsive movement, and mutual trust. Each time, the bear demonstrated not just recognition of the activities, but a sophisticated understanding of their underlying principles. "This goes beyond simple behavioral conditioning," Emma noted, reviewing her footage. "He's showing evidence of genuine cognitive understanding, adapting decades-old learned behaviors to current circumstances. This could revolutionize our understanding of ursine intelligence and memory." As the morning drew to a close, Thomas felt a growing sense of hope. They had documented something unprecedented, a wild bear demonstrating not just remembered behaviors, but an understanding of complex social interactions and safety protocols. Surely this would help convince the park authorities that Boomer was not a threat, but an extraordinary opportunity for learning and understanding. The success of the morning's demonstrations had barely been documented when the first signs of trouble appeared. Emma's radio crackled with urgent messages from park rangers. A group of tourists had somehow gotten wind of the friendly bear and managed to slip past the restricted area markers. "This is exactly what Morrison was worried about," Emma said, quickly packing her equipment. "Someone must have talked about what they saw, and now people are trying to get their own close encounters." Thomas felt his heart sink as they hurried toward the reported location. The very thing that made Boomer special, his unique relationship with humans, could now put him in danger. They could hear voices in the distance, excited chatter, and the occasional shout that shattered the forest's natural quiet. As they approached, they found a group of about 8 tourists, phones held high, moving deeper into Boomer's territory. Despite the clearly posted warning signs and barriers, they had pushed through, drawn by the allure of what they imagined would be an easy photo opportunity with a tame bear. "You need to leave this area immediately," Emma called out, her authority clear in her voice. "This is a restricted zone for ongoing research and wildlife protection." A man with an expensive camera turned, looking annoyed at the interruption. "Hey, we heard about the bear that remembers people. We just want to get some pictures." "What's the big deal?" "The big deal is that you're putting both yourselves and a valuable research subject at risk," Thomas replied, trying to keep his voice calm despite his growing anxiety. "This isn't a zoo exhibit. This is a wild animal in its natural habitat." A woman in the group scoffed, "But we heard he's friendly, that he plays games with researchers. Surely a few photos won't hurt." Before either Thomas or Emma could respond, a deep huffing sound came from the trees to their right. The tourists turned excitedly, cameras raising, but Thomas could tell immediately that something was wrong. The sound wasn't Boomer's usual gentle greeting. It carried a note of stress and warning. Through the trees, they could see Boomer's massive form. His body language was tense, his movements showing clear signs of agitation. The casual intrusion of so many strangers into his territory, their loud voices and sudden movements, had triggered his natural defensive instincts. "Nobody move," Thomas commanded, his voice cutting through the excited chatter. "Lower your cameras slowly and avoid eye contact." But the tourists, caught up in their moment of excitement, did exactly the opposite. Phones and cameras flashed, voices rose in excitement, and someone even threw a granola bar in Boomer's direction, a horrifyingly dangerous attempt to lure him closer. Boomer's reaction was immediate. He rose to his full height, letting out a warning roar that finally made the reality of the situation clear to the intrusive visitors. Screams replaced the excited chatter as the group began to panic, some turning to run. Exactly the wrong response to a bear encounter. "Stop!" Thomas's voice boomed through the clearing. "Walking slowly. Move behind me." No running. To everyone's amazement, Boomer's aggressive display ceased at the sound of Thomas's voice. The bear remained alert and clearly unhappy, but he held his position, displaying the controlled response that Thomas had worked so hard to instill in him decades ago. Emma efficiently coordinated the tourists' retreat while Thomas maintained his position, speaking calmly to Boomer in the same steady tone he had used during their morning exercises. The bear's agitation gradually decreased, though his eyes remained fixed on the retreating group. Once the tourists were safely escorted out of the restricted zone, Thomas turned to Emma with grave concern. "This is exactly what we were afraid of. People don't understand. Boomer's unique behavior isn't an invitation for interaction. If anything, it makes the boundaries we establish even more important." Emma was already on her radio, reporting the incident to park headquarters. The response was actually remarkable, she noted between communications. Despite clear provocation, he displayed controlled defensive behavior rather than aggression. He even responded to voice commands in a crisis situation. But Thomas knew this incident would have repercussions. The park administration's worst fears about public safety had nearly become reality. Even though Boomer had shown extraordinary restraint, the very fact that such an encounter had occurred would raise serious concerns. "We need to get ahead of this," he said, watching Boomer gradually relax and move back into the deeper forest. The incident proves both the risks and the potential. Boomer showed that even under stress, he remembers and responds to the protocols we established. That's not a liability. It's an incredible asset for park safety. Emma nodded, but her expression remained worried. "Try telling that to Morrison and the safety board. They'll see this as proof that the situation is untenable. We need to strengthen our case, and fast." As they began documenting the incident, Thomas couldn't shake the image of Boomer's response. the way he had moderated his natural defensive instincts, showing neither the complete comfort that might encourage further human approaches nor the unchecked aggression that would have justified the park's worst fears. Even in crisis, he was still walking the complex line between wild and wise, between natural instinct and learned behavior. The afternoon following the tourist incident, the atmosphere in the park's administrative building was electric with tension. Thomas sat before an emergency committee, the morning's research footage playing on one screen while security camera images of the tourist encounter played on another. The contrast between the two scenarios could not have been more striking. "This is precisely the situation we were concerned about," Morrison declared, pausing the tourist encounter footage at a particularly tense moment. "We have visitors deliberately breaching restricted areas to seek out this bear. It's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt." Sarah Matthews studied both sets of footage with a furrowed brow. "Though I have to point out," she interjected, "that the bear's response was remarkably controlled. Dr. Bell, could you explain what we're seeing in terms of behavioral patterns?" Thomas leaned forward, seizing the opportunity. "What you're seeing is the result of early cognitive development that has persisted through decades of wild living. In the morning footage, Boomer demonstrates complex problem-solving and social interaction skills. In the tourist encounter, he shows the ability to moderate his natural defensive responses based on learned behaviors." Emma, who had been analyzing the footage frame by frame, added her scientific perspective. The bear's reaction to the tourists was actually a textbook example of appropriate defensive behavior. He gave clear warning signals, maintained a safe distance, and de-escalated when the situation was properly managed. This isn't just learned behavior, it's sophisticated threat assessment and response. "That's all very fascinating from a research perspective," Morrison countered, "but it doesn't change the fact that we have a potentially dangerous situation. Word is spreading about this bear. Social media is already picking up the story. We can't risk having more tourists trying to breach the restricted areas." Thomas felt his frustration rising. "Then we strengthen the restrictions, increase ranger patrols, implement stricter penalties for violations, but don't punish Boomer for human misbehavior. He's demonstrated exactly the kind of intelligent, measured response we would want from any wild animal." Dr. Patricia Chen, the park's lead wildlife biologist who had been quietly observing until now, spoke up. "What concerns me isn't just the immediate safety issue. We're dealing with something unprecedented here. This bear is demonstrating levels of social cognition and behavioral adaptation that could revolutionize our understanding of wild animal intelligence. Moving him to a controlled environment might seem safer, but we'd lose the opportunity to study these behaviors in their natural context." The debate continued for hours, with proposals ranging from immediately transferring Boomer to Cedar Grove to establishing an entirely new research protocol around his unique behaviors. Thomas felt like he was fighting for more than just Boomer's freedom. He was defending the possibility of a deeper understanding between humans and wildlife. "Look at this morning's footage again," Thomas insisted, rewinding to the seeking game sequence. "This isn't just remembered tricks or conditioned responses. This is an animal demonstrating understanding of complex social rules and boundaries, the same understanding that allowed him to respond appropriately to the tourist incident." Emma pulled up her latest analysis on her tablet. "We're seeing consistency in his behavioral patterns that suggests these aren't isolated incidents or coincidences. His responses are methodical, measured, and appropriate to each situation. Even in the tourist encounter, he displayed what we might call graduated response, escalating his warnings in proportion to the perceived threat." Sarah Matthews rubbed her temples, clearly wrestling with the complexity of the situation. "The research potential is undeniable, but so are the risks. We need a solution that addresses both," Thomas seized on this opening. Then let us develop a comprehensive management plan, one that protects both Boomer and the public while allowing us to study this extraordinary case. We can establish clearer boundaries, implement stricter enforcement, and develop educational programs to help people understand why maintaining distance is crucial. Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. We could turn this into a model for human-wildlife coexistence studies. Instead of seeing Boomer's unique behaviors as a liability, we could use them to better understand how to manage human-wildlife interactions throughout the park system. Morrison still looked skeptical, but his opposition seemed to be softening. Any such plan would need extensive safety protocols. And we'd need guarantees that the research wouldn't encourage more unauthorized attempts at contact. What if we integrated it into the park's existing wildlife education programs? Emma suggested. Use it to teach visitors about respecting wildlife boundaries rather than trying to breach them. Show them that understanding animals doesn't mean trying to make them into pets. As the meeting continued, Thomas felt a glimmer of hope. The tourist incident, while concerning, had actually demonstrated something crucial, that Boomer's unique capabilities made him not more dangerous, but potentially more valuable to understanding how humans and wildlife could coexist safely. Outside the window, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park's vast expanse. Somewhere out there, Boomer was going about his life, walking the line between wild and wise, between natural instinct and learned understanding. His very existence challenged their assumptions about wildlife behavior, offering a glimpse of possibilities that went beyond simple conservation to true coexistence. The dawn broke over Yellowstone with a peculiar clarity, the kind that seems to sharpen every detail of the landscape. Thomas stood at the edge of the research station's porch, the two bells quiet at his belt, watching the wilderness awaken. The previous day's heated discussions about Boomer's fate had left him both exhausted and determined. Emma emerged from the station, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. The morning tracking team reported fresh signs near the eastern ridge, she said, handing Thomas one of the mugs. He's staying within the designated research zone, exactly as we hoped. He understands boundaries better than most humans, Thomas replied, a hint of pride in his voice. Always has. Even as a cub, he knew the difference between play areas and restricted spaces. The park administration had given them 1 week to demonstrate the validity of their proposed management plan. Every movement, every interaction had to be meticulously documented and analyzed. The pressure was enormous, but Thomas saw it as an opportunity to prove what he had always known about Boomer's extraordinary capabilities. I've been reviewing Dad's old research notes, Emma said, pulling out her tablet. He wrote something interesting about your training methods. He said you never really trained Boomer. You communicated with him. There's a difference. Thomas nodded, memories flooding back. Your father understood what made Boomer special. Traditional wildlife training is about conditioning responses. What Boomer and I developed was a dialogue. He learned not just what to do, but why it mattered. They spent the morning setting up new observation points around the research zone. Each location was carefully chosen to allow monitoring while maintaining safe distances. Thomas insisted on incorporating elements that would be familiar to Boomer, specific arrangements of stones, marked trees that mimicked their old boundary indicators. It's fascinating, Emma observed as they worked. You're not just creating observation posts, you're building a communication system that he'll understand. Everything in the wilderness is about communication, Thomas explained, placing a distinctive arrangement of rocks that had once marked safe rest areas. Animals read the landscape constantly. What we're doing is adding a layer of meaning that bridges our world and theirs. As they finished setting up the last observation point, a familiar huffing sound drew their attention. Boomer had emerged from the tree line, his massive form moving with that distinctive grace that belied his size. He approached one of the stone arrangements, investigating it with obvious interest. "Watch," Thomas whispered to Emma, who was already recording. "See how he's processing the markers." Boomer moved from one arranged location to another, his behavior showing clear recognition of the pattern. At each point he would pause, scent the air, and make small adjustments to his position, exactly as he had been taught to do decades ago when establishing safe observation distances. "This is remarkable," Emma breathed, her scientific skepticism giving way to wonder. He's not just recognizing the markers, he's actively engaging with the system. He's demonstrating spatial memory and pattern recognition that goes beyond basic behavioral conditioning. Thomas watched as Boomer completed his circuit of the observation points. The bear's movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if he was reaffirming his understanding of this shared language of boundaries and respect. "What you're seeing is the result of trust built on understanding," Thomas explained. "Boomer learned these patterns because they made sense to him, not because he was forced to follow them. That's why the knowledge has endured for 40 years. The bear settled at the edge of a clearing, maintaining perfect position relative to the nearest marker. His posture was relaxed but attentive, showing none of the agitation that had marked the tourist encounter. "Look at his body language," Emma noted, still recording. "Complete comfort within the established boundaries, but perfect adherence to safety distances. This isn't just remembered behavior. It's active, intelligent engagement with established protocols." Thomas felt a surge of hope. This was exactly what they needed to demonstrate to the park administration, that Boomer's unique capabilities made him an asset to park safety, not a liability. His understanding of boundaries and ability to communicate through established patterns could serve as a model for wildlife management throughout the park system. As the morning wore on, they documented Boomer's interactions with various elements of their observation system. Each movement, each response added to the growing body of evidence that this was no ordinary case of human-wildlife interaction. This was something deeper, more sophisticated, a genuine dialogue between species that had somehow endured 4 decades of separation. "You know what this reminds me of?" Emma said softly, reviewing the footage. "Those studies of indigenous tracking systems, where knowledge of animal behavior is passed down through generations. But this is different. This is direct transmission of understanding between species, preserved across decades." Thomas watched as Boomer began his careful retreat into the forest, each movement still perfectly aligned with their established markers. "That's why we can't lose him to Cedar Grove," he said firmly. "What we're seeing here isn't just about one bear or one human. It's about the possibility of true coexistence, about finding ways to share this wilderness that respect both human safety and animal freedom." The week of observation was drawing to a close, and tension hung in the air like an approaching storm. Thomas sat in the research station's small library, surrounded by decades of wildlife studies, including his own early papers on Boomer. Emma entered with a stack of fresh data printouts, her expression a mixture of excitement and concern. "The latest analysis is extraordinary," she said, spreading the papers across the desk. "We're seeing consistent patterns of sophisticated behavior that challenge everything we thought we knew about long-term wildlife cognition. But the park board meets tomorrow," Thomas finished her thought. "And they're still concerned about liability issues." The data before them told a remarkable story. Over the past week, they had documented Boomer not just remembering old patterns, but actively adapting them to current circumstances. He had demonstrated an understanding of complex territorial boundaries, shown appropriate responses to various human presences, and even helped maintain natural order by deterring other bears from approaching research areas. "Look at this sequence," Emma pointed to a series of photographs. He's actually modified the old boundary-marking behaviors to account for new tourist paths. He's not just remembering, he's problem-solving in real time. Thomas studied the images, his heart swelling with pride and concern. He's showing them exactly what they need to see, but will they understand what they're looking at? A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. Sarah Matthews entered, her expression grave. We've got another situation developing. A group of wildlife photographers is planning some kind of protest tomorrow. They're claiming that keeping this intelligent bear in the wild is too valuable an opportunity to pass up. They're planning to enter the restricted zone en masse to document his behavior. Thomas felt his blood run cold. They'll be putting themselves and Boomer at risk. Don't they understand that his unique behavior depends on maintaining proper boundaries? That's the irony, Emma said bitterly. Their very attempts to document his intelligence could force the park to remove him for safety reasons. Sarah nodded grimly. Morrison is already using this as evidence that the situation is becoming unmanageable. He's arguing that the bear's reputation alone is creating a public safety hazard. Thomas stood up abruptly, gathering his field gear. Then we need to make our case tonight. One final demonstration of what we're really dealing with here. What are you planning? Emma asked, recognizing the determination in his voice. Something that will show them the true value of what we have here, Thomas replied, checking the bells at his belt. Boomer's not just a curiosity or a scientific anomaly. He's proof that there's another way to think about the relationship between humans and wildlife. The afternoon sun was already casting long shadows as they set up their equipment in a carefully chosen location. Thomas had selected a spot that incorporated elements from all their previous successful interactions, natural boundaries, clear sight lines, and established markers that Boomer would recognize. We'll document everything, Emma assured him, setting up multiple camera angles. Every movement, every response. We need to show them that this isn't just about one extraordinary bear. It's about the possibility of a new approach to wildlife management. Sarah watched the preparations with professional interest. You really believe this can work? That we can find a way to preserve both public safety and this unique situation? I believe we have to try, Thomas replied, surveying the landscape before them. What Boomer represents goes beyond just scientific interest. He's living proof that intelligence, memory, and understanding can bridge the gap between our world and the wild. If we lose that because of fear and misunderstanding, the sun was setting as they completed their preparations. Somewhere in the gathering dusk, they could hear the distant sounds of the forest settling into its evening rhythms. Thomas stood at his marked position, the twin bells quiet at his belt, waiting for the right moment to begin their final demonstration. Whatever happens tomorrow, Emma said softly, what you and Boomer have shown us changes everything we thought we knew about wildlife cognition and memory. Thomas nodded, his eyes scanning the tree line. It was never just about memory, he replied. It was about understanding. About finding a way to share this wilderness that respects both human safety and animal dignity. As darkness began to fall, they could hear the first owls beginning their nightly chorus. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, the board meeting, the threatened photographer protest, the final decision about Boomer's fate. But for now, in the gathering darkness, Thomas prepared to show one last time the extraordinary possibility that existed when trust and understanding bridged the gap between human and wild. The pre-dawn air was crisp with anticipation as Thomas made his way alone to the clearing. He'd convinced Emma and Sarah to let him make this final approach without their immediate presence, though they monitored from a safe distance with their equipment. Some moments, he knew, required the purest form of trust. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, painting the clouds in delicate shades of pink and gold. Thomas carried both bells now, their soft chiming marking his careful progress through the morning mist. Every step felt weighted with 40 years of memory, hope, and possibility. "This is our moment, old friend," he whispered to the awakening forest. "Everything we've learned, everything we've shown them comes down to this." He reached the center of the clearing just as the first true rays of sunlight began to pierce the canopy. This place held so many memories, of training sessions that had become games, of trust built through understanding, of a connection that had somehow defied time and nature itself. Thomas raised the bells, letting their combined voices ring out across the valley. The sound carried clear and true in the morning air, a melody that spoke of shared histories and unbroken bonds. He rang them in the old pattern, 3 clear notes, a pause, then 2 more. It was their original signal for trust and safety, a sound that had once meant home to a young bear learning to bridge 2 worlds. The forest fell silent, as if holding its breath. In the distance, he could hear Emma's voice over the radio, reporting movement on their monitors. But Thomas kept his focus on the clearing, on the spaces between the ancient trees where shadows still clung to the morning mist. Then he heard it, the familiar huffing sound that had always been Boomer's way of announcing his presence. Through the thinning mist, a massive shape emerged. Boomer moved with deliberate grace, his silver-touched fur catching the early light. His eyes, still bright with intelligence, fixed on Thomas with unmistakable recognition. Instead of stopping at the usual distance, Boomer continued his approach. His movements were careful, measured, each step a conscious choice that spoke of trust earned through decades of respect. Thomas remained still, his heart pounding with a mixture of awe and understanding. When Boomer was just a few feet away, he did something extraordinary. Slowly, with infinite gentleness, he lowered his massive head until it rested against Thomas's chest. The gesture was one of complete trust, transcending the boundaries between wild and tame, between human understanding and animal instinct. "Oh my God," he heard Emma whisper over the radio. "Are you getting this?" "Every angle. This is unprecedented." But Thomas barely heard her. In that moment, he was transported back 40 years, to the day when a young bear cub had first shown him that the boundaries between species were more permeable than anyone had imagined. The weight of Boomer's head against his chest carried all the trust and understanding they had built together, preserved somehow through 4 decades of separation. They remained like that for several heartbeats, man and bear connected by something that defied scientific explanation. Thomas could feel Boomer's steady breathing, could sense the perfect balance of wildness and wisdom in the creature before him. This was no simple case of an animal remembering tricks or responding to conditioning. This was something far more profound, a shared understanding that had endured through time and distance. When Boomer finally lifted his head, his eyes met Thomas's with an intelligence that seemed to encompass both his wild nature and their shared history. The bear took a careful step back, maintaining perfect positioning, close enough to demonstrate their connection, far enough to show his understanding of necessary boundaries. "You never forgot," Thomas said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just the patterns and the signals, but the understanding behind them. You kept that all these years." Boomer responded with the same soft, huffing sound he had used as a cub when pleased with a successful interaction. He moved with careful precision through a series of positions that demonstrated his complete recall of their safety protocols. Approaching, retreating, maintaining appropriate distances, all while keeping that incredible connection alive through posture and response. The sun had fully risen now, illuminating the clearing with a golden light that seemed to bless this extraordinary moment of reunion. In the distance, Thomas could hear the excited chatter of the research team over the radio, documenting every detail of this unprecedented interaction. But here, in this space between wilderness and understanding, time seemed to stand still. The park's conference room buzzed with an energy unlike anything its walls had witnessed before. The morning's footage played on the large screen, showing the extraordinary interaction between Thomas and Boomer from multiple angles. Even Morrison, who had been the strongest advocate for removing the bear, sat in stunned silence as he watched the scene unfold. "In all my years of wildlife management," Sarah Matthews began, her voice carrying a note of wonder, "I've never seen anything like this. The level of trust, the precise understanding of boundaries, the clear evidence of long-term memory and cognitive processing, it's unprecedented." Dr. Chen was practically vibrating with excitement as she analyzed the footage frame by frame. Look at the bear's body language throughout the encounter. Perfect control, deliberate movements, clear understanding of proximity protocols. This isn't just remembered behavior. This is active, intelligent engagement with established safety parameters. Emma stood before the board, her scientific training giving weight to her words. "What we witnessed this morning changes everything we thought we knew about ursine intelligence and memory. But more importantly, it demonstrates something crucial about wildlife management, that understanding and respect can create safer interactions than fear and restriction." Thomas sat quietly, still processing the profound experience of the morning. The weight of Boomer's head against his chest had carried 40 years of trust and memory, a connection that transcended ordinary human-animal relationships. But now came the crucial task of helping others understand the significance of what they had witnessed. "The photographers' protest group is still planning their action," Morrison pointed out, though his voice had lost its earlier adamance. "This discovery could make the situation even more complicated. More people will want to see this intelligent bear for themselves. Then we use this as an opportunity for education." Thomas finally spoke up. "What Boomer has shown us isn't just about intelligence or memory. It's about the possibility of coexistence based on mutual understanding. We can use this to teach people about respecting wildlife on its own terms." Dr. Chen nodded enthusiastically. "Think about the research implications. We could develop new protocols for wildlife management based on understanding natural behaviors rather than just enforcing restrictions. This could revolutionize how we handle human-wildlife interactions throughout the park system." Sarah Matthews studied the footage again, paying particular attention to the way Boomer maintained perfect distances, even during the closest interactions. "The bear demonstrates better boundary awareness than most humans," she observed, "and he's actively choosing to follow these protocols. That's what makes this so extraordinary." "Exactly," Emma agreed. "This isn't about a tame bear or a circus trick. This is about an intelligent wild animal choosing to engage with humans in a structured, safe way." The protocols Thomas established 40 years ago weren't just training. They were a framework for communication between species. The board members exchanged thoughtful looks. The morning's demonstration had shifted the conversation from one of risk management to one of unprecedented opportunity. Even Morrison seemed to be reconsidering his position. "What if," Dr. Chen suggested, "we established a special research program around this case, not just to study Boomer's unique behaviors, but to understand how his example might help us develop better approaches to wildlife management across the board?" Thomas felt hope rising in his chest. "We could create educational programs that teach visitors about real wildlife behavior, not the sanitized version they get in controlled environments, but the complex, intelligent interactions that actually occur in nature." Boomer's case shows us that respect and understanding can create safety more effectively than fences and restrictions. Sarah Matthews began making notes. "We'd need to develop new protocols, of course, strengthen the restricted zones, increase educational outreach, maybe even create a dedicated research team to document and study these behaviors. And most importantly," Emma added, "we protect Boomer's freedom. while using his example to teach others about responsible wildlife interaction. He's showing us that there's a middle ground between completely wild and completely controlled, a space where understanding creates natural boundaries. As the meeting continued, Thomas's thoughts returned to that morning's interaction. The way Boomer had approached, the perfect balance of trust and wild dignity in his movements, the profound connection that had somehow survived 40 years of separation, it all pointed to possibilities that went beyond traditional wildlife management. The sun was setting by the time the board reached its decision. Sarah Matthews stood to make the announcement, her face showing both professional satisfaction and personal wonder at what they had witnessed. The decision of the park board reverberated through Yellowstone like ripples in a clear mountain lake. Boomer would remain in his territory, monitored but free, his extraordinary case becoming a cornerstone of a new approach to wildlife management and research. The morning sun painted the mountains in shades of gold as Thomas stood at his favorite observation point, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. "The research team is already setting up the new monitoring stations," Emma said, joining him with her ever-present tablet. "Dr. Chen is calling it the Boomer Protocol, a new framework for understanding and documenting complex wildlife behaviors in their natural habitat." Thomas smiled, watching the early light catch the dew on the grass. "Your father would have loved this. He always said that true conservation wasn't about controlling nature, but about understanding it well enough to coexist respectfully." The new management plan was comprehensive. The park would establish a dedicated research program around Boomer's case, using it to develop better approaches to human-wildlife interaction. Educational programs would teach visitors about the complexity of animal intelligence and the importance of respecting natural boundaries. Most importantly, Boomer would remain free to live as he had for the past 40 years, a bridge between the wild and human worlds. "The photographers group actually agreed to help," Emma reported, scrolling through her messages. "Once they understood the significance of what we're doing here, they offered to document the project properly, from safe distances and under research protocols. They're calling it the wisdom of the wild." In the distance, they could see Boomer moving through his morning routine. His massive form navigated the landscape with practiced ease, respecting the boundaries they had established while maintaining his essential wildness. He paused occasionally to investigate the new research markers, showing the same intelligent curiosity that had marked him as special 4 decades ago. "Look at how he inspects each new element," Thomas observed. "He's not just accepting them, he's understanding their purpose. That's what makes him extraordinary. He chooses to participate in this dialogue between our worlds." The morning air carried the sound of the bells, now part of the park's official research equipment, used to mark observation zones and maintain safe boundaries. Their chiming had become a symbol of the project, a reminder that communication between species was possible when based on mutual respect and understanding. Sarah Matthews arrived with the final paperwork, her face showing satisfaction with how things had turned out. "The new protocols are officially in place. We're already getting requests from other parks and wildlife preserves interested in studying our approach. You've started something significant here, Thomas." "Boomer started it," Thomas corrected gently, 40 years ago, when he showed us that there was another way to think about the relationship between humans and wildlife. We just had to be ready to understand." As if in response to his name, Boomer appeared at the edge of the clearing. He moved with his characteristic grace to one of the designated observation points, maintaining perfect position as he watched their small group. The morning light caught his silver-touched fur, highlighting the distinctive scar that had first brought Thomas back to Yellowstone. "You know," Emma said, her voice soft with wonder, "every time he demonstrates these behaviors, this perfect understanding of boundaries, this willing participation in our research, he's teaching us something new about what's possible." Thomas nodded, feeling a profound sense of completion. This was more than just a personal victory or a scientific breakthrough. It was a testament to the possibility of something deeper, a way of relating to the natural world that went beyond simple conservation to true understanding. As the sun rose higher, Boomer began his retreat into the forest, each movement still perfectly aligned with their established protocols. The bells chimed softly in the morning breeze, their sound carrying across the valley like a promise kept through decades of separation and reunion. "The sound of those bells will always be special," Thomas said, watching Boomer disappear into his wild domain. "Not just for what they represent about our past, but for what they promise about our future." Emma smiled, understanding the deeper meaning in his words. "A future where we learn to listen to the wilderness on its own terms?" "Exactly," Thomas replied, his heart full of gratitude for this extraordinary second chance. "Where every ring of the bell reminds us that some connections transcend time and distance, teaching us that the greatest wisdom often comes from learning to listen to the wild heart of the world." Dear listeners, we hope this extraordinary tale of Thomas and Boomer has touched your hearts and opened your minds to the incredible possibilities that exist when we approach the natural world with respect and understanding. Their story reminds us that wisdom can come from unexpected sources, and that some bonds truly can transcend time and distance. If this journey into the heart of Yellowstone has moved you, we invite you to join our community of storytellers and nature enthusiasts. Subscribe to our channel to receive more inspiring stories that explore the profound connections between humans and the natural world. Leave a like if you believe, as Thomas and Boomer showed us, that understanding and respect can build bridges across any divide. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear about your own experiences with the wisdom of the wild. Remember, every ring of the bell is an invitation to discover something extraordinary in the world around us. Until our next adventure, may you always listen for the quiet wisdom that nature shares with those who are ready to understand.